Well, hello, everyone. As people kind of start to come through, I'll kind of just tee some things off. This session is part of a day-long summit. We're talking about all things leadership. So if you want to check out any of the other sessions, you can just go to hypercontext.com/blog. It's all there. Super big thank you to Benjamin. He's got a really cool talk coming. I've heard just an insane amount of good things about him as a leader. And so I'm so excited to learn personally.
All right, we can kick things off. Thank you, Hiba, for the introduction and for managing all of this in, I think, under a week, which is very impressive. So let's get things started. My name is Benjamin, and we're about to talk about going from an individual contributor to a manager. We're going to talk specifically about how communication changes and what changes about your role that might surprise you, and definitely surprised me when I made that change. And essentially, that boils down to managing down, up, across, diagonally, all the places that you're going to talk to people in your organization. Before we dive into all of that, who am I? Why would you listen to me? My name, as I said, is Benyamin Elias, at Benyamin Elias on Twitter. I am the Director of Growth Marketing at ActiveCampaign. And on the side, I write Diamond Pencils, Substack. Just really wanted to get on Substack, join that train. But specifically, I talk about manager skills, soft skills, all of the non-technical things that make people more effective at work. I started at ActiveCampaign almost 4 years ago as an individual contributor, and I since became a manager of one person, and then a manager of 5, and then a manager of 12. And I have made plenty of mistakes in that time and learned quite a lot in that time, and really had to level up as a manager myself. And it surprised me how management worked. This was me, and if you are an individual contributor, you as an IC, you mostly talk to one person, and it's your manager. You may talk to peers socially, or you may work with peers as individual projects crop up, but mostly communication goes in one direction. You have one-on-ones with one person, you're really talking to your manager the most. When I became a manager, I thought this would be managing. It's the same, more or less. I talk to my manager. I still have my peers in the same way as I did before, and I've got my team, and that's just the extra thing that got added in. And everything else more or less stays the same, right? Nope, it didn't seem to work out that way, because communication as a manager is much, much messier as you move up in an organization. When you become a manager, the people you communicate with regularly changes. You talk to your manager, and you talk to your team, and you talk to your peers. You have more peers to talk to now, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But you also are talking sometimes directly to your boss's boss, sometimes directly to your boss's peers. Sometimes you're giving your manager the tools that they need to advocate for their boss and their peers. And it actually gets way messier, because you can say something to your manager, who says something to their boss, who says something to your peer, who says something to you. The chain, the spider web of communication in an organization gets messy. It's way messier than this even. And having the right mindset for management helps you navigate that web of communication without getting stuck in it. A manager is most effective when they are making their team more effective. We're going to talk about that a little bit as well. But fundamentally, you are trying to work across an organization to unblock your team, to get yourself the resources, whether that's budget, headcount, buy-in, to do the things that you need to do, and to prevent the fire drills that sometimes happen when people are not on the same page about stuff. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about what management is and isn't, and how misconceptions about what it is can break communication. We're going to talk about your first team, the people that you work with most closely. And we're going to talk about why you should change how you manage your team and how to manage your team to make all of the rest of this possible. 3 key ideas in this talk. Keep an eye out for these things. We've already talked a little bit about some of them, but we'll talk more. Who you communicate with, number 1. Number 2, your first team and how you work with them. Number 3, how you can turn your team into a council that runs mostly without your help. Keep your eye out for these. This is actually the first time that I've seen, this is funny, an eyes emoji that is this font size. I never realized that the eyes emoji has hazel eyes. That's so fun. What even is management. So I had misconceptions when I joined, and I still see managers, new managers, make these mistakes. Management is not teaching. Management is not managing production. And controversially, I would argue that management is not even principally about empathy. All of these are tools of management, but they are in service of the larger objective of management, which we'll get to in a moment. I'm going to go through these one at a time really quickly. Misconception: managers should teach. It makes sense. A manager's job is to make their team more effective, and your team can be more effective if they are better at what they're doing, if they have more skills. I actually think that professional development is huge and is part of the role of a manager. The trap here is when managers spend a lot of time directly training skills. It tends to be that a new manager isn't really sure what they should do as a manager, but, oh, I was really good as an IC. I can teach individual contributors how to do their job better. The challenge with this is that it takes a long time and it's inefficient. You as the manager need to be, again, in that web of communications and advocating across your peers and across the team to get resources, headcount, budget, and buy in all the other things. We'll talk more about the specifics there later. And if you're spending a lot of time teaching, you're not spending your time in those other places. The fix for something like this: curate resources, have a ton of documentation, have good examples of this is the way to do it and this is the way that needs work. Have stuff that people can look at asynchronously on their own time. You can create training sessions, which I'm a big fan of, that are Q&As with you or with an expert in a particular area, lunch and learns, peers teaching each other, anything that doesn't rely on a ton of manager preparation. And you can build feedback systems into your work. So there are QA processes, I imagine, in some of the things that you do. You can structure those specifically so that people get meta feedback about how they're doing in their role and use that as a teaching tool. Misconception number 2: managers manage production of work. A lot of managers will lean into the assembly line of their team. Oh, here's how you should be doing that in this GIF. Here's how you should apply those robot arms or legs. It makes some sense also because managers are responsible for what their teams produce. The manager is the person who gets the questions. But if you over lean into this, if you are micromanaging the production process, you're, again, not in the web of communication that ultimately gets your team the things that they need. And 2, you're actually training your team not to think for themselves. If you are making all of the decisions about things, if you solve the problems, then people will just come to you to solve it. There's not that learning opportunity and that autonomy to execute stuff on their own. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. There's a challenge here still, which is that, yes, you do need to be producing things and it needs to be at high quality. So how, if you are leaning out and not directly managing production super closely, do you do that? I think the fixes are: 1, create bounded autonomy for your team. I think of this as there's a green meadow and it's huge and it's amazing and people can run around and play in and build whatever they want. There's also a fence at the end of the meadow, which is where they come talk to you to get approval for things. We'll talk more about that later. 2, you use a system that lets the team QA their own work or QA each other and keeps you notified of the status of different projects. And then 3, you just check in every so often, look at an example of the work. Is this good enough? Is it up to standard? If it's not, a few times in a row, you can always lean in and shift the production. And then the controversial one: management is empathy. This is tricky because great leaders are empathetic and great teams have a lot of psychological safety. One thing that I experienced going from a team of 1 to 5 to 12 was that it got a lot harder to manage empathetically in the way that I had been doing it. I started by really sitting down with someone and going through all the problems, and we could do that week in, week out. I only had one report, but at a team of 12, you can't take that emotional burden for the whole team. I see this a lot with new managers where they become the lightning rod for the negative emotions of their team, and that's just difficult. There are really effective ways to be empathetic and to be effective as a manager, and I think I have here the fix. It doesn't need a fix exactly, just a shift in how you think about what management is, how you push people, how you are empathetic, how you show up day to day. Each of these misconceptions has the same thing in common, which is that it treats management as something that you do to your team. You do it at your team. It's like, management, I'm throwing some management at you. That's not what management is. Your effectiveness as a manager comes from working outside of your team to get more resources for your team. When your team runs on its own, they can be making full use of the resources that you get them, and you can go get them more resources. It's a great relationship. So what is management? I love this definition from Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel. He wrote this in High Output Management, which is my favorite book about management. A manager's output equals the output of their organization plus the output of the neighboring organizations. That first piece is relatively intuitive. Yes, I'm a manager. I am measured by the output of my team. I still see sometimes new managers can struggle with it a little bit. I've seen when a team is struggling, either that the new manager will shift responsibility onto the individual contributors. No, it's all on the manager. And I've also seen the manager try to protect individual contributors too much by shifting to other teams. And it's still all on the manager to make things more effective. But it's this second piece, the output of neighboring organizations, that's interesting. And that's the reason that managers have to be in the web of communication of their organization. Your peers, as a manager, have their own teams, which means that if you can have an influence on your peers, if you can lend them your resources, if you can be on the same page with everyone, now everyone is pulling in the same direction and everyone's team becomes more effective. That's the role of the manager, is to both increase their output and their team's effectiveness and to influence across an organization. How do you do that? Who do you talk to? Oh, where are you going to go? All the places. Here are some of the people you meet in your manager story. Your boss, your boss's boss, your boss's peers, your team, your peers, your peers, your peers again. Okay, I'm making the point that your peers are important. Your peers are the most important group of people that you'll talk with, and we're going to go more in depth on that relationship in a moment. To start things off, the boss rush, the boss's boss, the boss's peers. What do you have to do to these people? How are you going to manage up to these people? This, again, presentation is not just about managing up. It's up, down, across, diagonal. So we won't go too far into this specific topic, but the quick version, to stop you from getting executive heat, which I learned was a short-lived show where executives ate very hot sauce, but they have this great GIF. Your job is to manage. Your boss's job is extra managing. They are a manager of managers, at least, because you report to them. And just as you want to work with other teams to make sure that projects move forward smoothly, they work with other departments or larger other teams. They work with their peers to try to get you what you need. For that, they need your help. When your boss's boss asks them, hey, what's going on with that project? If your boss can just pull out, here's the documentation, here are the slides, the docs, the plans, all of the things that you have given to them, that is extremely confidence building. They can get an answer to their boss right away. They don't have to come to you, and then you have to assemble the thing. When you are prepared with whatever format, slides, docs, with resources that show the thought process behind your work, the impact of your work, the timelines, you have this packaged up for executives in a way that they can understand without you needing to walk them through it live. Those documents can just spread in an organization and you don't necessarily have to shepherd them or field a lot of one-off questions. You're giving your boss the tools they need to advocate throughout the organization. That's what you can do individually. But okay, that's not all of managing up, right? Like there's more to it. And the key to it is not doing it alone. You do it with that most important group of people that you talk to as a manager, your peers, your first team. First team is a term that comes from Patrick Lencioni, who wrote The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And he makes this point, and I agree with him, that your team is not primarily your direct reports. The people that you should spend the most time with is your peers. Your relationship with your peers in an organization is what makes you and your team more effective. Why? You will inevitably need resources from other teams. That's number one. In organizations, it depends a little bit on the size, but especially as you get bigger, your team isn't going to have all of the pieces on it that you need to get everything done. You're going to need help from design or from copy or from product or from development, other parts of the organization. And if you have strong relationships with those managers, it becomes much easier to get the help that you need. You don't have to submit anonymous forms and never hear back from anyone. The second is related to managing up. You and your peers can collectively be bargaining with the bosses to affect the direction of the organization. Bosses hear problems all day, every day. If you go to your manager and say, I really need this thing. Okay, people ask for stuff all the time. That doesn't always register as like a serious, urgent request. If you and your peers agree about what is needed and you can collectively go to your manager and say, this is what we need, suddenly that becomes a much stronger case for your manager to take to their manager. You get this group of people, this other team that can negotiate together. 3, you and your peers are a decision-making unit. What happens when things go wrong? I think every organization has these fire drill moments where there's an urgent problem to solve. And if you don't have a strong network among your peers in a company, you have to spend the first moments of a crisis figuring out who you even need to talk to. You don't know what each person does. You don't know how good each person is. You don't know what they can contribute. When you actually get into the room, you might be missing someone, or the conversation is stilted. You don't know how to set next steps. When you have a team of peers, when you have your relationships already in hand, you have the ability to just say, oh, this is the problem. Here are the 5 people I need. Let's all hop in a room or on a call and hash this out really quickly. You also have an understanding of just the dynamics of that group. Here's the person who's going to introduce the topic. Here's the person who's going to assign next steps. Here are each of the people who the next steps should go to. You can make decisions and solve problems and take the answers to your boss. And it just makes you less reactive, and it makes it much easier to do your job. And finally, your managers, the manager level of an organization, those are the people who keep work on track. I sometimes think about an organization as a ship where the CEO is at the helm turning the wheel, but the wheel doesn't connect to the rudder automatically. It's not like a wood pole. It's a chain of people who are trying to pull the rudder in one direction or the other. And those are the managers. When managers are pulling in the same direction, great. The whole organization, the whole ship goes in the direction the CEO wants it to go. But if people are splintering into their own teams, they have their own little projects that don't ever talk to each other, you just got people pulling on the rudder wildly. The ship goes in circles. I have made plenty of mistakes with peers. For a little while, I was not getting the headcount or the budget that I needed for my team. I wasn't able to grow effectively. We kept having requests come in from other parts of the company, but we didn't have the resources to deal with them. And I realized finally that this is the problem that I was having. I wasn't effectively communicating in the web of the company. This is the example of how I overcame that in one specific case. We needed a copywriter. Needed this headcount. I was still writing the copy when I had an 8-person team. I could see the problems that was causing. I would write copy for larger projects than I should while in meetings or between meetings, and it just wasn't to the quality that it could be. Or we had areas that we weren't effectively communicating in at all. Our lifecycle emails could have been more developed. Our paid ads could be more efficient. All these various things, but the copywriter headcount wasn't prioritized because people didn't see the cracks yet. Instead of going, well, not quite instead. At first, I went to my manager and said, hey, I need this copywriter. But again, a manager gets asked for stuff all day, every day. Instead, I started using my one-on-ones with my peers to build this case. In these one-on-ones, we used to work, and we still do, we would workshop production processes. Okay, we work with design. We're trying to work out how a web page should come together. At what stage does something get passed to, apologies, there are apparently a lot of fires in Portland, Maine, is something that I've learned. Working with design, at what stage does something get passed to the design team or to the development team? Does copy come first or design? Can we get a designer and a copywriter in the room together? Do we have a kickoff meeting? Who needs to approve it? We're working through these details. And in the course of those conversations, I get to make this case. So I hear from revenue marketing, we should test new ad copy. I would love to. If we had a copywriter, we could test all the time. I can't write 20 ad sets to test. For SEO, we should optimize title tags. We have a lot of default copy on our site, especially for procedurally generated web pages. If we had a copywriter, I would love to be able to do that. And again, from design, if we kick off a project and we have copy and design work together right away, you get the idea. And the result of this was that I didn't even have to mention the copywriter to my boss. My boss came to me and said, I keep hearing from everyone that Benjamin needs a copywriter. And she congratulated me on making that happen. But working with my peers helped them see what I could already see because I had the functional expertise in copywriting. This is what helped me ultimately push up on my boss and get the headcount, and our copywriter started this past Monday. So how do you work with your peers? I strongly advocate working in one-on-ones. Sometimes one-on-ones get a bad rap. They tend to be less agenda heavy. They tend to not have a clear output. Everyone's always pushing back against meetings. I would argue that the unproductivity, if that's a word, is part of the benefit. You're trying to do relationship building. You don't necessarily need an agenda for that. You are creating the space to discuss something with a peer and just get to know this person so that when you do have a problem that needs addressing, you can Slack them or email them, or you know how to communicate with that person. You create these space for these conversations of these two types. One, little problems that you would never actually bring up. Like you would never schedule a meeting to talk about this. It's something that happens in passing. It's, oh, like designers keep tagging me in Figma and I don't ever go into Figma. It's not the best way for you to get your thing. Shoot me a Slack note. Things like that don't tend to come up unless there's space for them. And you create this space for very big problems, for big systemic issues. Here's how our whole process works. Here's how our workflow goes. That's not something that's going to be tackled via Slack or email, and it's something that won't necessarily get discussed. It's never urgent enough to warrant its own meeting until, of course, it is urgent enough, at which point it's too late. And finally, it's fun, right? You're at work. It's more fun to like the people you work with and know the people you work with, and it has its benefits for relationship building. So when you work with your peers, you're trying to build a relationship with them and understand what they are facing. How can you help their problems? How can you be the most helpful person in the room? How can your team help their team and their team help your team? Ultimately, if you're all moving in the same direction, you're all going to get more of what you want anyway. But wait, none of this is about management, is it? Like we're all talking about communication and peers and managing up and bosses, and he said something about Portland fires. None of it is about how you actually manage your team. And the way that you manage your team does have to change in order to free up the time to be operating in an organization like this. So I always ask, can you pass the hit by a bus test? All right, what's the hit by a bus test? If you got hit by a bus tomorrow, would your team be able to operate without you? How autonomous is your team? How dependent is your team on you? And the more dependent your team is on you, the less likely you are to be able to operate in the rest of your company. If you spend time with your peers, you need your team to do more on their own, to solve their own problems. And you got to get yourself counsel. Probably not the Senate from Star Wars. That didn't go very well. But a group of people who can make decisions effectively on their own or with minimal input from you whenever possible. You want this. You want a collection of brains all working on the same problems. In this case, you are this first brain and your team is these other 5 brains. You do not want this. You don't want 5 bodies trying to take instructions from one brain. This is what happens when people lean in too far on the teaching, on the production management, on the empathy, or have the wrong framework for it, is you wind up micromanaging, or having to set the tasks that each person on your team works on instead of having them solve problems on their own as their own independent brain. You have a counsel when your team solves their own problems. Something that's really common for new managers is to manage each person on their team on their own. Okay, I have 3 people. Well, I'm going to talk to you, and I'm going to talk to you, and I'm going to talk to you. But those 3 people are not talking to each other at all. It's a team of individuals, or rather, it's a group of individuals instead of a team. You want to make sure that they can operate as a team. And I note this is exactly what you're trying to accomplish with your peers. You are creating at your level a decision-making group for the decisions that managers face. Your team can become a decision-making group for the functional area that your team is covering. How do you do it? How to make a counsel in 3 not so easy steps. It's hard. Like I'll say point blank, it's difficult. I am sharing the steps and I still mess up the steps all the time. I like to think I'm doing okay, but it's something that you got to have in your head all the time. These are the 3 things. We're going to go through them one at a time. Get your team to talk to each other. I don't know how you solve problems without talking to another person, or solve problems with another person unless you're talking to them. And your team's first instinct is often going to be to go to you as the manager. That's tricky. It's easy to just answer the question or address the situation when really you want to be able to nudge people towards working with their peers before they ever come to you with the situation. How do you do that? The first way is that you create space for those conversations. You have a Slack channel, an email alias, a team meeting. You need a place where your team is working through problems together. I say this with some caution. So team meetings, I've seen a lot of them turn into the manager talks and presents information. I have made this mistake before. I have also seen people have slides and there's no discussion about them. People share what they're doing, but there's no discussion about it. You got to get your team talking to each other in this time. And it doesn't even necessarily matter. Ideally, it would be addressing real issues, but it doesn't matter if the solutions that come out of that time are the right ones. What's important is that you're building the muscle of getting them to talk to each other. You can build peer work into your day-to-day work. People on your team have different expertise. If they're working on projects that require the other expertise, great. You have a natural point where they have to talk to someone else. If people are reviewing each other's work, they are having to talk to each other. You want to create a team that has to talk to each other just to be able to get their things done. They can't go a whole day or an extended period of time without being in touch with their teammates. And then finally, when that person comes to you with a question or with an idea or something else, point them to their peers whenever it's possible. That takes us to the next point, which is don't solve problems for your team, at least not right away. Someone comes to you with a question. You could direct them to a peer. Maybe it's not that kind of question, and you do have to engage with the situation in a different way. If you answer the question, you're creating the skeleton instead of the brain. You want to make sure that the next time someone has a question, they don't just immediately come to you. You come to me with a question, I have an answer. The next time you have a question, I have an answer, and I have an answer, and I have an answer. And over time, the team stops trying to answer their questions on their own. Instead, when you get a question, try to get at what their perspective is on the situation. If you ask what and how questions to get them to explain to you how they've reached their conclusions or how they've reached their point of indecision that led them to ask a question, you're forcing them to think through the issue. Sometimes they wind up with the answer on their own. I actually, when I first started doing this, I made a small mistake, which is someone would ask, should I do this or this? And I would say, what do you think? But too often, especially as we've gone remote, that became, what do you think? So sort of ominous, not what I was going for. Softer questions. What would you recommend? What's led you to this point? How have you been thinking about this so far? Anything that gets them to explain their perspective is going to help you, one, answer the question and give you context if it does get to that point. And then two, forces them again to think through the situation. How do you resolve the situation? You might wind up answering it after they've gone through the thought process. That's okay, as long as you've gotten them thinking. And you might say, I trust you to make the call on this. If you have the judgment that they have just as much info as you, and even if they make a decision that's not quite what you would have done, it's still going to be pretty good. I trust you to make the call on this. That's a big step for a team's autonomy. And then finally, push for a decision at the right time. One thing that teams of peers will wind up doing sometimes is still assessing at this point, not wanting to finally make the call. They generate a few different options of what they can do. They've talked to a few different people, and now they're going back and forth between stuff. This is where you as a manager can lean in just a little bit and say, I think it's time to make a decision here. To do that, you notice when your team is talking in circles, when they've said the same thing a few times, or when they're just repeating what their options are but not committing to one. That's a good moment to push for a decision. You can notice also when teams start trying to get approval from everyone. That's something that happens a lot in teams of peers because no one feels like they have the formal authority. So they're like, oh, do I have to ask this person? Do I have to ask this person? Do I have to ask this person? In that context, all they have to ask is you. But you can push them a little bit and say like, oh, well, what type of information or what feedback on these ideas are you looking for from that person? And that tells you if they are looking to make their decision better or if they're looking to justify their decision, and lets you try to push for it. And then finally, you can just say, I think it's time to make a call here. And either they make the call or you do. And that's fine, again, as long as they've done the work up to that point. So let's look back at some of those management misconceptions, because I feel like I alienate some people when I say empathy is not good. It is good. Teaching is good. Building good systems is good. Empathy is good. All of these things are good things. Yes, your team can be more effective if they have more skill in their roles. Yes, you as the manager can probably think of the places that a system is going to stick and smooth those out before you get to the roadblocks. And yes, your team will do better if they feel heard, if you've created an environment of psychological safety. The key here is that these are tools you can use to make your team more autonomous. And that's your objective. Increase the autonomy of your team so that you can operate with peers and create bigger things by rallying more resources to them. When your team is a council, you get to spend most of your time in this sticky web, but with the people who help you not get stuck. It means that you can push up and across in an organization. You don't have to do that on your own. You have this group of people who you can rally and who really do have quite a lot of influence by virtue of the teams that they manage collectively. And you can get the buy-in, the resources, the headcount, the budget. You get the things that your team needs in order to do their work more effectively. For more like this, a few good books about management. High Output Management by Andy Grove is, again, my all-time fave management book. The Making of a Manager by Julie Shao, formerly of Facebook. I think that's a great book for an introduction to management. She covers, okay, what do you do in the hard conversation where you have to be empathetic, or how do you run one-on-ones, things like that. And then Turn the Ship Around by Lieutenant David Marquette. He really covers the question asking component. How do you get people thinking for themselves instead of just being skeletons trying to take instructions from your brain? More from me specifically, you can @ me on Twitter, @ Benyamin Elias. Just reach out. DMs are open. You can read more about management or soft skills at diamondpencils.substack.com. That's where I just write about all the things that I have made mistakes in. And that's what I've got for you, folks. Remember, your peers are your most important group. They're what help you make your team more effective.
Thank you. Oh, that was awesome. I mean, I personally have some questions that I'm definitely going to tee up, but if anyone has some questions, the Q&A button, I believe is just right at the bottom. I'm still acquainting myself with Zoom today. It's been a crash course. And so feel free to toss in your questions. Something that resonated with me so much, which I know I definitely have to get so much better at. And for context, I have a team with just one direct report. And so I think it's definitely a little less chaotic than the scale that you're experiencing at ActiveCampaign, especially as a team at Hypercontext, or about 18 people. And so it's a little bit easier to have those communication channels. But I think something that resonated with me was helping your team be more autonomous. I think that's something that I need to do a better job at, is just framing questions. Like when they bring problems up, which I just want to highlight again that I thought was cool, is instead of giving them the answer or like giving them the direction, just asking them to think for themselves. And yeah, I think the hit by the bus is an incredible analogy and so true. And now I need to like just think about this every day. And so I guess one of the questions I have for you is, you shared a lot of information. What is one thing that you think is the most important takeaway, or maybe one thing that you think managers who are listening in right now should take away and do today or tomorrow with their team? Is it book a peer one-on-one, for example, with other people across the organization? Is it something completely different? Yeah, I'll tee it off there.
Yeah, if I'm going to say like an action step, something that you could literally do right now while we're talking, I think book the peer one-on-one would be the thing. If sometimes, like you mentioned, an 18-person company, it's less, the lines of communication can be a little bit less formal sometimes, which is helps you move quickly. But the other thing that I would suggest to any manager is just notice the next time you get a question from one of your reports. Start there. The hardest part about, maybe the second hardest part about responding to questions with investigation is even realizing that that's happening. I still do this sometimes. Someone will ask me a question and I'm in the middle of something and I just want to like respond quickly to get them what they need, and then we're done with it. Or I mean, even on calls sometimes, like you don't even realize that someone is asking you a question, you're solving the problem for them. And just noticing that is sort of the first step to being able to investigate. Once you can investigate, I just focus on those what and how questions, but that's what I would say. You can silly things that I've done include having tallies. I would just like quickly jot down, oh, that happened. And just having that physical action made me realize like, oh yeah, I do have to be paying attention and not just answering questions all the time.
Yeah, no, that's a really cool, neat way to go about it. Maybe I'll start telling. I know my direct report's listening in, so she'll have all my tricks now. But I had another question. I just lost my train of thought. Something you were saying, I wrote it down actually. So managers manage production was something you were kind of pushing for. And I guess when it comes to that, I know you want to give your team full trust. You want to build them up so that they can make these decisions, and you can take a step back and they have more autonomy. So in those scenarios, I guess for me, my question is, how do you balance giving your team autonomy with making sure that they feel supported? Yeah, how would you go about balancing those two things?
I would always draw the distinction, and I'm always thinking about this. What's the thing that I am uniquely in a position to do that someone else is not uniquely in a position to do? I can do things at the manager level with peers, with my boss, with my boss's boss. That's just harder for my reports to do. A lot of the stuff as it relates to them doing their own work, yes, I can lean in, and yes, I was a good IC, and that's what led me to the path of management. Like I know some things about that, and I can help, but they can figure that out too. Like I figured it out, they can figure it out. The caveat there is there are going to be elements of production that the manager is better at. A simple example with my team is that we needed images for our blog posts. Like we would write something and we'd want something from design, but the way our production was set up was we would finish the post and then we would ask for the images. And then it's like, all right, well, we can get it to you in a week and a half, 2 weeks. It's like, whoa, hang on, that's not going to do it. Like we want to publish some of this stuff. In that context, my team needs images. They can go to design and ask for stuff, but they're going to get that 2-week timeline. I can go to our creative director and say, hey, like I would love to set this up so that we can get you involved earlier in the process, even automate the creation of Jira tickets so that we don't have to like spend time filling stuff out and you just get links to the info you need. What's the like, not even minimum, but like ideal amount of info so you don't need the whole post to get started with. I can negotiate that conversation, which unblocks someone and leave it to them to manage some of the other pieces. And again, like I'm always there when people have questions. I'm just going to respond with questions, which again is like a coaching to get them to solve their own problems.
No, I love that. I mean, I remember having my last manager at the past company. That was his thing. He was just always asking me questions. And at the start, it like just took me off guard. I was like, what do you
Mm,
mean? Like I'm supposed to think for myself? Like that's kind of cool. Because I went from a micromanager to someone who's just like, think for yourself, like, you know, grow. And I was like, whoa, this is a very cool switch. And so definitely recommend managers just ask questions. And then my final question, it's not probably not as relevant to this topic, and then we'll kind of wrap up. When you made the switch from being a
mm.
really good IC, high performer, and that ultimately led you up to start making more of you in a sense, and growing people that way, what was probably the biggest shock to your system? Was it these communication channels at the start? Was it something else? Yeah.
Yeah, the shock phrasing is interesting because I think the hardest thing was the communication channels, but that was like a slow burn. Like I didn't
Yeah.
realize that that was an issue until I started having trouble getting some of the things that I needed. I was like, but I have all these amazing results. Like why wouldn't we just invest in of that? It's because a lot of people have good results and all of them are telling their managers about it and asking for more resources. It's like, oh, I didn't realize that. I have to change my approach here. There's a component of that that's like anytime something is not happening, like what is it? What is your role in that situation? It would have been easy to say, I'm not getting more resources. There's no investment in content. There's none of this stuff. I was like, no. Like people care about it. They just care about a lot of stuff, and there's a finite amount of stuff that we can do. So I think it is. I wouldn't call it a shock, but the slow burn of getting into that web of communication.
Cool. Yeah, I'm sure like you gave me like a little bit of a sneak peek at what's to come as I grow in my career. And so I'm already stressed out, but feeling more prepared. If-
Ultimately, the great thing about working with peers is like you really do get to have like fun in those
yeah,
conversations. Like why it's so much less fun to solve a problem or a fire drill with people that you don't know than people that you talk to all the time.
absolutely. Okay, well, we're coming up on time. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for doing this. This was an awesome presentation. I've learned a lot. I'm excited about my future and what I can do at this point. Hi there. The session you just watched was part of a day-long leadership summit where we had over 23 leaders share their expert advice on what leaders can do today with their team, from remote management to one-on-one meetings. To check out the rest of the sessions, you can click the link here for the full playlist. You can also subscribe to our channel as we'll continue posting all things leadership. And you can also visit our website at hypercontext.com. Thanks.